Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest introduced to you now. R.D. Dikeman, PhD, is a theoretical physicist and loving husband of Roxanne Dikeman, PhD, a clinical psychologist. Their world was turned upside down when their young son, David, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. After following conventional dietary advice for this condition that led to uncontrollable blood sugars, dangerous hypos, and many sleepless nights, R.D. discovered the work of Dr. Richard Bernstein, a medical doctor who has used a low carbohydrate diet to control his own type 1 diabetes for more than 50 years and pioneered some of the most groundbreaking research on low carbohydrate diets for diabetes in the modern era. Through working closely with Dr. Bernstein and as a founder of TypeOneGrit online community, RD has helped provide thousands of other individuals and families living with type 1 diabetes with information to reduce the threat of complications and attain the truly normal blood sugars that all type 1 diabetics deserve. TypeOneGrit is an amazing Facebook group of type 1 diabetics who are following Dr. Bernstein and his protocol, which consists of a very low carbohydrate diet, no grains, no sugar, no starch, and no fruit to normalize blood sugars. R.D. Dikeman, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
All right, man. Thank you very much.
It's such an honor to host you. There's certain episodes of podcasts. I listen to podcasts all the time, but there's certain episodes that always really stand out to me as being quite special. And I will never forget the episode that you did on Dr. Sean Baker's show. I don't always listen to every episode of his, but I generally really like what he does. And for whatever reason, like that's one that I remember listening to. I remember where I was listening to it the first time, hearing you get so fired up about your son almost dying before you even knew what was going on. And it really like struck home how difficult type 1 diabetes is to manage. And so I just have to say, like, after hearing that, I believe it was January of 2023, I've been trying to follow you and your work and get on top of learning more about this because this is a crazy issue.
I remember when I was on Sean, you go through this sort of catharsis of remembering what it was like to be diagnosed and what you're told and struggling to implement the stuff that you're told and then finding out, this alternative method and going through all the pushback that you get to try to make sure that your child stays healthy. And when you start talking about that, I get very emotional. Even still, it is really such to be newly diagnosed. It is such a traumatic experience, and because a large fraction of the time, people that are newly diagnosed have a child who is in mortal peril, and your life changes completely after your child is diagnosed. So when you remember those times, it is an emotional experience, and there's something interesting about grieving as a parent of a newly diagnosed type 1, because right away, right out of the gate, when you're diagnosed, it's kind of like having a newborn in some sense. When you go to the hospital with your wife and you give birth, 24 hours later, you bring that newborn home and everything is different, right? And type 1 diabetes is the same. It is a 24/7, 365 experience. And it's all over you right at the beginning. So when you think about that, even 10 years later, I'm doing it right now. It is a truly traumatic experience, and there is no time to grieve. You have to perform immediately because of the condition demands that.
Wow. Well, I think our listeners can tell by listening to your voice, and the people watching on YouTube can see clearly on your face, the emotion does hit home for sure. You can kind of understand a small fraction of how emotional this would be and how this would have gone for you. I would love to take credit for this. It was your idea, so I'm going to give you all the credit for it. Today, we decided we're going to create a kind of resource maybe for people, parents especially, who have children who are just diagnosed, where I'll try to be asking the best honest questions that I can. I also have a list of questions that people from the TypeOneGrit page and your page have put on there, and they are, questions from, honest parents who are trying to figure some of this stuff out. So we're going to try to cover that. I think that was a great idea, and I think that will be a great resource for people out there, and nobody better to explain how the dynamics of this work. I recall you on one podcast saying, like, yes, you came across Dr. Bernstein's work and his book, and it was huge, and it's a big encyclopedia, but it's also not the like, do this, do that, practical, this is what you need to do today. You had to kind of discover that on your own. So I think you're going to be a really great resource for that. So I'm looking forward to this conversation today. But obviously, first, I would really love to hear your personal story. I think the audience would really love to understand how this all came to be. Again, I've heard you describe this as like it drops off a cliff so quickly. And like you said, like you don't have time to try to figure out what's the best way forward. You have to act very quickly. So do you mind taking us through the story of, David, your oldest, excuse me, and his diagnosis?
Yeah. It is. It is, when I think about the diagnosis of Dave, what even even back then, and we social media was just sort of getting started. So the first thing you're trying to do is, and I'm skating right through the whole Dave had DKA, he almost died. That story is very severe. Dave's diagnosis was very severe, and Roxanne and I didn't know anything about type 1. So we were not in tune with what was going on. We had no idea. So Dave was very close to dying. And that is not an unusual experience. It's on the spectrum of experiences. So some people are familiar with type 1 and they catch it right away, or some people are lucky to have doctors who can understand that things are going on. But a lot of people have doctors that fail them and they don't know anything. And as you said, you go off the cliff so fast. So in Dave's situation, which is not atypical, he lost, I don't even remember, 10, 15 pounds. He was a 9-year-old. So he lost so much weight so fast that it took us off guard. We didn't even, we were just going about our business. We didn't even know, and at first when we started talking about it, we thought, well, maybe Dave's going through a gawky stage or something like that. So, you have that experience, but then when you are diagnosed and you realize that, your doctor or a doctor is telling you that your child has type 1, the natural inclination is to learn about it. And you're going to get some punctuated lesson from your doctor. You'll be put through kind of a mill-like experience where you're given maybe a handout. You meet with a hospital dietitian. That's pretty standard. We'll talk about that. But what we didn't have was a, what now resource. There was nowhere to go for us. And that really bothered me, and it stayed with me. And that sort of predicts the arc of my next 10 years of advocacy, where we were trying to generate materials so that people could, and not just newly diagnosed people could learn how to manage their disease properly. And to be blunt, and we'll get into it, people are being taught an incorrect method about how to normalize their blood sugar and remove the threat of complications. And as Bernstein would say, the standard method is geared towards high blood sugars and complications. And that's a mathematically provable fact. And what we are doing is different than what's being taught. There's a never-ending amount of, there's a infinite amount of inertia behind this method that doesn't work. No one is incentivized to change it. And you have to go outside the boundaries of the standard practices to learn how to save your child from complications of diabetes. And so,
Wow.
I'm always sympathetic to create a resource that newly diagnosed parents or people with, or not parents, people, it's the same method, can have. So that was like the idea behind the theme of this chat that we're going to have.
Yeah, I love that. So to help set that up, you talked about the system and the things that are recommended. Tell us what that experience was like for you. Who sat down with you? What did they say? What were your thoughts? How did you approach things? Like what was the standard that was given to you in the beginning?
Um, well, okay, so Dave was very sick, and near death. He had to go to the ER. There's a huge story behind that, but it was he was minute to minute, um, from dying, right? So it was a really acute situation, and I say that because what it does is it underscores how vulnerable we were as parents when your child is that sick and you are, uh, when you have no, I had no idea what type 1 diabetes was. Uh, like I knew something, from TV, like sometimes they have to take candy and there's insulin, and I don't understand any of that stuff and never had to. So, it just washed over to me. So that's the environment. That's your origin. That's your initial starting point as a parent or someone who's newly diagnosed, is maximal vulnerability. Okay. And then so you're in this supine position to just accept everything an authority will tell you. And that's what happens next is you're lined up with an endocrinologist, who is going to give you some kind of cursory discussion about how to manage type 1 diabetes. We were told, he drew in an easel. Very nice man, by the way. He drew on an easel. You know, carbs make your blood sugar go up. Insulin makes your blood sugar go down. The goal is to balance these guys. You might go up a lot during breakfast, come back down. I have the picture still. Then you go up at lunch, come back down. Then you go up at dinner, come back down. He told Dave, if you go too low, you have a hypo and you can die. That's too much insulin. If you stay high too long to avoid the hypos, then you're going to get the complications of diabetes. So there's a balancing act, right? And you take insulin. When you eat carbs, you're taking a set amount of insulin to try to keep things level. And the famous quote is that Dave said, well, I just won't eat carbohydrates then. And we laughed at Dave. I laughed at Dave, in his hospital bed. We chuckled, well, Dave, you want to play sports, you need energy. Kids need carbohydrates, right? And that's a profound moment because it is just one, but a big one, of the 10 to 15 to 20 myths that you're going to have to punch your way out of to get out of this standard care model, because there's many more myths that are going to stop a parent cold from ever exploring any other way out of this standard myth, set of a standard method. And that is, back in the day, there was no resources for us. So I had to, for every one of these myths, I had to do research on my own. And a lot of it involved talking to Bernstein, and we ended up making videos. I've got to make videos about this because people need to have these resources. It's tough to go through your book and just read the book, right? So that's one of them, is the kids need carbs for energy. That's like the starting point for the myths that you need to question to get out of this. You're literally, the standard model is going to put you in a death spiral, and that's going to ruin your life. And if you want to escape that, you have got to educate yourself. You have to learn how to break out, and then you have to learn all the things that you need to know to actually implement this alternative method. Let's call it an alternative method, which but we'll talk about all that, what it really means, what you have to eat, and how you use insulin and all that.
Yeah. Okay. So that would be probably my very first question. If I'm putting myself in the shoes of a parent, you kind of explained, okay, carbohydrates make your blood go up, insulin makes your blood go down. That seems straightforward enough. No problem. When I'm teaching somebody about nutrition, like for example, this summer I gave a seminar series in my neighborhood where we did 15 different seminars all about nutrition and teaching people basics from calories in, calories out to different things about cholesterol and the idea that fat makes us fat and plant toxins and all that stuff. We went over all of that, and I'm always surprised when I teach the one about macronutrients. These are the 3 macronutrients. This is protein. This is what it does. This is what it doesn't do. This is fat. This is what it does. This is what it doesn't do. Here's carbohydrates. This is what it does. This is what it doesn't do. And give examples of all of those. I'm always surprised how weak the knowledge is around what these things even are. Like most people can't even tell you what a protein versus a carbohydrate is, or they think carbohydrate is candy, but they don't think about fruit or other sources that most people just don't know. And why would they want to know or want me to be taught that? And who would want to teach them? But anyway, that would be my first question as a parent is, okay, well, first of all, I don't know what carbohydrates are. And second of all, if that's what carbohydrates are, well, all his friends are eating it. I don't want my kid on some weirdo diet where he can't go be normal with his kid. You just told me I could take insulin when I ate that. Why do I have to worry about carbohydrate?
Okay, man, we're diving in, right? But let me back up a little bit because, the endocrinologist gives you that little cursory talk, right? And this feeds right into what you're saying. And you're going to get your scripts from your endocrinologist, and you're going to get your appointment set from your endocrinologist because you're going to check in early, right? And often before you kind of wean yourself to, every 6 months or something. But the next person that you're going to meet is maybe the hospital dietitian or maybe the endocrinologist dietitian. The endocrinologists typically kick that can over to somebody else. And the vast majority of people that meet with a dietitian describe their experience as meeting someone who typically is in very poor shape themselves and preaches the standard food pyramid diet. So they'll give you like mimeographs. The mimeographs look like they're from the 1970s with menus on them. And so for breakfast, you might have something like an oatmeal, a skim milk, half a banana. For lunch, you might have turkey. Okay, so these are, the theme here is like Weight Watchers type 19. Like if you're old like me and your parents had a Reader's Digest magazine and there was articles about food, like low fat diet, right? So it's always like juice, lean meats. For some reason, salmon is always salmon and broccoli. So it's this super unpalatable, low fat diet that they're putting kids on. And if you're not eating any dietary fat, what are you going to eat for calories? Kids need calories. So necessarily they eat calories. And here's the problem with that. The problem is that for people without type 1 diabetes, that diet we now know has resulted in the type 2 diabetes epidemic and the obesity crisis. And we can get into that later. But what about people with type 1? People with type 1 have to inject insulin to cover the meals that they eat. One thing that you're told early on, which is one of the myths that you have to get over that we discussed earlier, and we're going to bring these myths up all over again. One of the myths you're told is fundamental to the structure of the standard model of type 1 diabetes treatment, which is carb counting. Simply put, you have to add up the amount of carbohydrate you have to eat, you're going to eat, and then you somehow determine by grams, okay, how much insulin. And the idea is that if you have skill at doing this task, you should be able to match the two things up and your blood sugar should stay flat. Okay. So that's the method. So there's a couple of things that are interesting there. First of all, we're going to go back to Dave's initial comment, which is why I just won't eat carbohydrate. So what's going to happen if we follow Dave's method? Like, what if Dave just eats a steak for lunch? Would he take any insulin? The standard model of carbohydrate counting would say no, he wouldn't require insulin. But that's wrong. We know that protein requires insulin to properly metabolize. It does in non-diabetics and it does in type 1 diabetics. That's sort of a fundamental point of Bernstein's book. So right off the bat, the standard model is an invalid or at best an approximation. The next point that you have to consider is how my pancreas is going to work in a much different way than injected insulin. When I inject insulin, it's going to go into my system and do its thing and bring blood sugar down. My pancreas, the beta cells in the pancreas that secrete insulin, they're constantly, because they're glucose sensitive, they're constantly measuring your blood sugar and giving the requisite amount of insulin, secreting it to keep the blood sugar in check. So you have a feedback mechanism as a non-diabetic to cover these foods. Well, what happens if I'm eating a big load of carbohydrate and I take some insulin and I've miscalculated because I'm not smart enough? I'm saying that sarcastically. What will happen is I will have a hypoglycemia event. And so the question then is, does this method that they're teaching you work? Can you get good at it? Can you live a life where you end up with no complications of diabetes, no effect on your total lifespan, and you live a relatively normal life except for the inconvenience of injecting insulin and eating, food that you can measure? You can't eat freely, let's say. You can't just go to the fridge. Everything has to be considered. But if you do that, will it, quote unquote, work? And the answer is emphatically no. This method that kids are being taught and people are being taught doesn't work. Kids with type 1 diabetes that follow this standard model average an A1C of around 8%, which is an average blood sugar of about triple normal levels. It's an average blood sugar of around 200. And it's not a constant 200. You're going high into the 300s, and then you're going down to the 40s. It's this, we call it the blood sugar roller coaster. That blood sugar roller coaster causes over 100 complications of diabetes and will shorten a child's lifespan by more than a decade. That's the research. You will not be told that. You have to learn that on your own. We've left this information. We'll leave it in your podcast, but this information is all over the place now. You just have to seek it, and you have to get your head out of the sand. Okay, so this method doesn't work. Not only that, but what's happened in the last 10 years is that the type 2 diabetes epidemic has hit the type 1 diabetes community. So kids now with type 1 diabetes have more obesity, higher obesity rates than non-diabetic kids, where it's already a national catastrophe. So not only are the kids getting inflammation from constant chronic high blood sugars, but they're getting fat, they're becoming obese, and they're developing double diabetes. This is the standard. My son, and by the way, when you introduced me, the most important thing in the introduction we left out, which is that my son has had diabetes for over 10 years. He's had an A1C of 5.0% or less and average blood sugars in the 80s and 90s. But he takes plenty of insulin. There's no cure here. We work on that 24/7. We can get into that. We work 24/7 on his diabetes management because that's just the nature of the disease, right? So you contrast Dave's experience with the standard experience of the type 1 child. And you would think, and Dave's been very vocal, he was on Sean Baker too. You would think that Dave and me would be held up by the standard American Diabetes Association, JDRF, all these organizations beyond type 1 that you're going to see when you become, in this type 1 community. You would think, oh, Dave's going to be the keynote speaker of every diabetes event or every diabetes charity event. They're going to hold him up. Look what you can do with this disease. Nope. The standard model of diabetes and the industry that's behind it will try to suppress the voices of people doing well. They will not tell you what the consequences are. And so that's why we're making this podcast, right?
Wow. Okay. So that would be then my next question. I'm going to read this word for word from one of our mutual friends, Michael Fitzpatrick. His question, again, word for word: why are type 1 diabetics told by the doctors to aim for blood sugar and A1C levels that are abnormally high? And at what A1C do we start seeing complications? And then I would add to that, well, what complications are we talking about? Because if I don't understand blood sugar and I hear that, your blood sugar, Dave's blood sugar is in the 80s and his A1C is 5, okay, well, my son has type 1 diabetes and it's averaging 180. Like, so what? What's the big deal? What are some of these complications, and how tightly controlled do we need the blood sugar to be to not get those ranges? Because I also think a lot of the pumps that you can get, aren't they automatically set to keep you at 180 and you can't even like manually set them lower for some weird reason?
Yeah, sort of. So yeah, let's get into that. Okay. So now we're going to get into the specifics. Okay. So first of all, what's a normal blood sugar? A normal blood sugar, if I tested my blood sugar right now, my blood sugar would be around 83 milligrams per deciliter. Okay. And I want that blood sugar to be 83 when I wake up, before I eat, while I eat, after I eat. There's no benefit. There's only downside to having your blood sugar elevate. Okay. So you'll commonly hear, well, it's normal to go up to 140 and then you come right back down. Okay. That may be normal if you're eating the standard American diet, but it's not optimal. We know that elevated blood sugar starting from normal levels is a continuous risk factor for diabetic complications. And those diabetic complications start at an average blood sugar of about 100 and an A1C of about 5.0. Those are pretty good numbers to use, as numbers that you can remember. So there are studies in non-diabetics, for example, studies published by the ADA in the ADA's own journal that show that non-diabetics who have elevated blood sugars, and you can see that starting around 5.0%, the macrovascular complications, which are macrovascular is heart disease, let's just say heart disease, and the microvascular complications, those are the apathies like neuropathy, meaning your nerves, nephropathy, meaning your kidneys, retinopathy, meaning your eyes. Those are the three biggies, but there are it's affecting every system in your body, the high blood sugars. And we see that elevated blood sugars increase the rates of those starting from 5.0%. So even this language that the ADA uses about prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, those thresholds that they're using, which are something like you're not even a diabetic till you're 6.5%. You're not even a type 2 diabetic. No, you're doing damage at 5.5%. If your average blood sugar is 110, you're doing damage. That's almost 50% above normal. It's like 40% above normal. So that's the first thing. is people are not being told that the blood sugar goals that they have are, even if they meet them, are causing trouble. So typically what you'll see is newly diagnosed parents being told to keep their child at an average blood sugar of around 200 when they're sleeping. Or if you have an endocrinologist who's interested in your child's survival, he might say that you might want to run them at 180 or 160. And so you have these parents who say, yes, sir, I will do that. And they feed them this diet and they run them high. And you ask those parents, do you know what's going to happen? And they get angry. And they get angry because either they realize that they've been lied to, or, once you accept this paradigm, once you accept this high blood sugar narrative that you've been given, you it's sort of like you go into some sort of trance where you do anything you can to stop from questioning this narrative, and that goes back to the initial trauma that you experienced. Is you accept the authority guidelines and you go with it, and because there seems to be no way out, right?
Wow.
Same for the child too. Yeah.
Wow.
So
Okay.
the doctors run you high for totally understandable reasons. Why is the doctor telling you to run at 200? Why don't they tell you to run at 80, like Dave? Or like me as a non-diabetic? Why would you tell someone that when high blood sugars cause the complications? And the answer is obvious. The answer is because they know their system doesn't work. They know that if they tell a kid to run at a blood sugar of 80, the fluctuations that their system is causing the child are so massive that they know that eventually they're going to kill that kid. Their blood sugar is going to go so low that the kid is going to seize up. So, and they don't want to do that. They're going to get sued, of course. So what are they going to do? They're going to run you as high as they can get away with, so that you don't have these hypoglycemia events. That doesn't work, by the way, because their method of trying to match carbohydrate with injected insulin creates so much instability that you're more prone to hypoglycemia anyway. But they don't know any other way, right?
Wow.
Kids
Wow.
need
Well,
carbs.
yeah, right. And you're giving me a great idea. Like, I don't score very many goals in hockey. I need to make the net way bigger and I'd score way more goals. Like, if you change the goalposts, if you change the rules to include more people because the standard doesn't work,
That's right.
I'd get more goals at the very least. That doesn't mean I'm a better hockey player because of it.
So,
And
so Casey,
and that,
there's something called time in range, which is a new, since I got into the diabetes world because of Dave's diagnosis, that's a new phrase, time in range. And time in range is an industry phrase. And they're telling type 1 diabetics, instead of telling them how to normalize their blood sugar, they're telling them to run high. They're saying the range is up to 180. Okay. Now, you and I are if you and I were running 180, that's like double normal. That's at or above the renal threshold where your kidneys start pumping out glucose in your body. So your whole metabolism becomes deranged at that point. Yet the diabetes industry is telling you that's in range. And not only that, they're telling you that it's acceptable to go above that 30% of the time. You're allowed to go above 180. So there's your goalpost analogy. The diabetes industry is telling diabetics to run high rather than question their method of how diabetes is managed. That would be, I guess, understandable if there was no alternative, but an alternative exists, and it's not the alternative. And we should talk about this. This is not some niche thing. The alternative, the work that we did in TypeOneGrit, we have hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people who are normalizing their blood sugar. We have had Harvard professors study and publish papers on our group. Our most notable paper is a paper in the journal Pediatrics, which was the most popular paper of 2018. And Pediatrics is a big time journal. And that paper was covered in the New York Times. So this is not some niche, this is, we're not like doing astrology and playing with crystals over there. That's the alternative word could bring that about into your consciousness. What we're doing is, I'm a physicist, remember, what we're doing is physics. We're doing real science. We're approaching this problem of normalizing blood sugar as a scientist does, and understanding the mathematics of injected insulin and how it works. And we're using it in a way that does allow for normal blood sugars. And we should get into that.
Wow. Okay. Yes, definitely. Yeah, you caught my attention as a naive parent. You just caught my attention with the hyperglycemia. That doesn't sound great to have blood sugar very high. You also caught my attention with hypo. If it goes low and my kid could die, like that's not great. So you got my attention there. But you've also said some things that are either confusing to me or like I've never heard before. So maybe this is like tinfoil hat time. You mentioned the American Diabetes Association. You mentioned guidelines. You mentioned a phrase I've never heard before: diabetes industry. Diabetes
Right.
industry. What are you talking about? Like it's diabetes, control. I'm working with my doctor or my endo, and we're trying to control this. What do you mean? There's an industry, a diabetes industry, and you're mentioning the American Diabetes Association. Like they're not helping you. It's one of the most common questions we got on the list as well. Is like, why are you mentioning these things? I thought these are the people that are trying to take care of me and trying to give me the best information. And like you said, it's not new information. We're not reading tarot cards or anything. Like this is scientifically proven and it's out there. What's the disconnect? What's the problem there?
Diabetes industry is a term that I'm using to describe what I have witnessed and experienced in the diabetes world. And in the diabetes world, you have pharma, which is generating, the insulins, the medications. You have device manufacturers that are making CGMs and pumps. You have charities that are supposed to be doing research on curing type 1 diabetes. You have paid diabetes advocates who work for those people. And then you have these professional associations that are made up of, some kind of board where, they have maybe some doctors or something like that who are making guidelines. And what I see is this cabal is working hand in glove together. So, like the advocates, for example, you might go, oh, I want to go to a diabetes event. There's an event in my neighborhood. And there will be. And so you click on the event, you're starting to get spammed with stuff because somehow it got out that you're diagnosed, right? So you're going to start seeing stuff come to you, right? And you're going to go to this event and you'll take notice. You'll see a sponsored list at the end of, learn about diabetes. And then there's a sponsored list at the bottom, there's some like drink. And then there's some pharma company. And then there's a dozen, it's sort of like the race car driver with all the logos, right? All the industry logos. You're going to see all that stuff, right? And so I talked earlier about this incredible inertia behind the standard model, right? And That's what it is. And this is that sort of cabal is interested in propagating this industry, right? And what is the goal of any industry? The goal of an industry is to make profits. And who's going to be more profitable? A sick person who uses a lot of insulin, or a healthy person who uses much smaller doses of insulin, right? So that's
Correct.
in this situation. So we talked to Bernstein about it. Bernstein has a great line. When I say, is that the reason why? Is it all just money? And he will say, the situation stinks from every direction. And I believe that that is one of the problems. It's not the only problem. A situation as messed up, well, you said we could swear. So as effed up as this type 1 diabetes situation is going to have many root causes for explaining why it's messed up. The profit motivation is one of them, right? But there's a reason why Dave or I have never been invited, even though our research was covered in the New York Times. We've never been invited to the American Diabetes Association. In fact, I submitted a paper to the quote unquote scientific sessions, and it was of course rejected, because you're not allowed to talk about these things that the diabetics can normalize their blood sugar. But but that's part of the reason why the situation stinks and from every direction is the profit motivation. There are other reasons too, and they're worth noting, right?
Yeah. Wow.
I said earlier when we were talking, I said, to get out of the standard model of care, you have to punch your way out. And there's so many villains that or bad myths that you have to kind of get through to get out, right? But most people aren't even capable of doing something different than what their doctor advises. Like you're dead in the water right there. And who's determining what your doctor tells you to do? Guidelines. The doctors have to follow guidelines. What happens if the doctor says, "Oh, you don't have to follow those guidelines"? What happens if you have a problem? You can sue your doctor, right? And I told you that type 1 diabetics are 24/7, 365. You're on a balance beam your whole life. So the doctor's terrified of giving you non-standard advice because it's a litigious world that we live in. And so who's setting the guidelines? The professional associations. How are the professional associations funded? They're funded through industry. So there's this death spiral that you're constantly in. And there's no way out of that. So what you'll see is people who do escape, and they have kids that are running normal blood sugars. Most of them have very contentious relationships with their endocrinologists. Their endocrinologists, at best, refuse to be interested in, how are you doing this? Right? So we just went through 10 years with Dave, with his endocrinologist. He understands Dave's A1C is 5.0. And through 10 years, he never really was interested in what Dave was doing. It was like, that's the best that you're going to get. You're certainly not going to get anybody who actually understands how to normalize blood sugars, right? We should talk about how to normalize blood sugars. We'll get to that point eventually. But, I'm trying to set people up for understanding that there is a huge mountain that they have to climb just so that they can see the light at the end of the tunnel, right?
Yeah.
And if they don't climb it, and they're going to have to climb it on their own. We had to climb it on our own, but we left so much residue. And it's a different world now. You can seek this stuff out. You can Google low carb type 1 diabetes. You can find low carb groups on social media. So the information is out there. At the beginning, I would have said, we can't blame the parents. But now, you as a parent, the information's out there, and there's more pressure on you to do the right thing as a parent now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well said. Wow. I love that. Okay. So again, you're kind of selling me on the concept that these interests don't have my interests at heart. They're looking for profit. You hear the name American Diabetes Association, you think like, wow, this is government, this is all science, this is proven,
Yeah. It's
whatever.
not
And
government.
it's not. Yeah, exactly. It has nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
So I think that
Yeah.
can be quite surprising for a lot of people. And as
Yes,
we're
me too. I was
kind of talk,
surprised.
yeah, totally. The American Heart Association and talking about cholesterol, like that's not the best, group of medical doctors that came up with the best information and started this amazing thing. Like maybe that's how it started, but it's definitely not how it ended up all these years later. So again, as the parent who's like starting to uncover some of this and learn that there's an alternative, my question would then go to something like a reiteration, and it would be along the lines of, okay, so really carbohydrates are not necessary? Like, is that really the case? Like, my boy is growing again. I'm going to the kids' games. I've been going to their games since they were 6, and they clearly couldn't play, you know, half an inning of t-ball without, the Capri Suns and a candy
Yeah,
bar. Like, otherwise they're just gonna like fall over and die. How are they going to
that's
be
right.
fueled for all of their, playing in a playground? How are they going to be able to do that without a pack of mini Oreos or something?
Okay, so there's two good answers for this question. One answer is science. And first of all, there were no back in let's say 200 years ago, there was no such thing as Capri Sun, right? And yet people were lean, they were more physical. There was no obesity, right? Uh, and kids developed, right? Kids grew. So how did that happen? And the answer is physiologically, you run on a combination of fuels. So we're talking about macronutrients, right? There's three macronutrients. There's protein, fat, and carbohydrate. Let's think of fat and carbohydrate as a subgroup of something called energy. Okay. Your body runs on a combination of carbohydrate and fat. If you eat all carbohydrate and no fat, your body will run on glucose, which is carbohydrate. If you eat no carbohydrate and only fat, your body will shift its metabolism and run on fat. Okay. That's called the Randall cycle. So that's how both of my sons played sports. My non-diabetic son eats low carb to support his brother. Neither boy ate over 20 grams or 30 grams of carbohydrates a day since Dave was diagnosed. They eat fat, and the fat principally comes from the protein foods. When you're eating a piece of steak or a hamburger, it's not just protein, it has fat content, and that's the fat that we're using for dietary energy, right? You think of a donut as carbohydrate. It's not only carbohydrate, it has fat in it, right? So, and you use that fat for fuel. Fat is fuel, okay? So that's the technical reason. So then the question is, well, is that is that optimal? Like, can you play? Maybe you can survive, but is it optimal? And for that, back in the day, I didn't really know the answer to that. We had to we had to take the leap. It didn't make sense that Dave would do better with carbohydrate and roller coaster blood sugars than he would with fat and normal blood sugars. In fact, we would see him when he would get up in the 180, 190, 200. He would be exhausted, and he also would be unable to control his emotions. I saw him in a basketball game. Even as a low carber, you can go up to 200. I mean, this is not an easy thing. He was playing in a basketball game. He went up to 200 at halftime, and he had to walk off the court and go outside. And I went out, I followed him. I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, I just feel so crazy right now, right? Because he's not used to having high blood sugars. So that's the questions like, well, should I still be stuffing him with the Capri Suns and the Rice Krispie treats to give him some quick energy? Or is he better off at 80 and having a couple pieces of chicken a few hours before the game and using the fat and the chicken thigh? And what we see now in the TypeOneGrit group is that it's the low carb diet that favors the athletes. We have so many kid athletes, my kids included. My kids both had college scholarship offers from academic institutions, high academic, like MIT level institutions, to play sports, water polo for my youngest son, and football, and my son was like, second whatever state, all state basketball in Hawaii. The kids do beautifully. They've developed beautifully on this high protein diet. Just imagine, like, you're, this because you are in this field. But just imagine, and I ate like a slob when I was growing up and up until when Dave was diagnosed. Just imagine if you would have gone back in time and said, I'm not going to eat cereal for breakfast as a kid. I'm going to have an omelet. And I'm not going to eat all those French fries. I'm not going to eat the bun. I'm just going to have, an extra patty and a slice of avocado. What if you ate like that your whole life? You'd be, damn, man, you'd be ripped by the time you got 20. You would look like a Greek god, right? Instead, I was always kind of fat. And that's what happened. My kids look, they're all fucking 8-packed out, right? And that's what all the TypeOneGrit kids look like. They're all athletes. They're all scholars. They're all, have these shredded, lean, normal bodies. There's no growth issue. There's no, you think your brain is going to operate better when your blood sugar's like this? But that's what they tell you. They tell you, like, you're going to stunt your kid's growth. Nope. It's the high blood sugars that stunt your growth. They're going to tell you that the brain needs carbs to think. Nope. Your brain needs normal blood sugars. The brain is damaged by high blood sugars, right? The kids need carbs for energy. No. You have to have calories for energy, but the calories can come from fat, right? So I'm a little bit all over the place, but you're getting a kind of a feel, right? I'm trying to help you punch out a little bit. I'm telling you need to punch out of these myths that you're going to be hit with, and the research is out there. I just said, like, oh, the brain is damaged by high blood sugars. After you watch this video, if you're a newly diagnosed person, start Googling around. Google my name, or Google, brain damage. We know now what happens with high blood sugars and T1Ds. They have a mismatch between their gray and white matter ratios, right? So a non-diabetic will have a certain ratio, gray and white. And then those things start flipping around. That's not a good thing, right? My child's brain is being affected by these high blood sugars,
Yeah. I definitely sustained some brain damage when I was in high school, for sure. We switched over to the healthy, low-fat diet when my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer in like 1999. I graduated in 2002, and every morning was exactly what you said. It's skim milk and the cereal, and I was asleep. I slept through first period pretty much every day until I could get to my locker and get those nasty granola bars, the Walmart brand cheap granola bars that you could get that would give me a little pick me up. And same with after lunch. After lunch, I would always be asleep. And you mentioned a lot of the physical stuff. You also mentioned the brain, and think about what we could have looked like, and think of how we could have performed mentally going through school. You know what I mean? Like with a brain that was functioning properly, could have paid attention, maybe passed a class.
I was born in the middle of the food pyramid, and eggs were something you should not be eating eggs. I dutifully ate a bowl of total cereal with skim milk and orange juice for breakfast every day, because, like, people say, oh, well, no one really follows the food pyramid. Bullshit. I follow the damn food pyramid because I didn't want to get heart disease from eggs. Which is here's another myth you have to punch out of, right? Is that heart disease is diabetes, right? And diabetes is high blood sugar. You're not going to get heart disease from eating eggs. Now, I think people are awake to that now. That lie has been exposed. If you're believing that lie now, you are misinformed, and you probably don't feel like you're on certain ground. But 20 years ago, that was a fact. You had to eat whole grain grocery bread. You had to have vegetable oils. All this stuff that we were told, I think people know now. But when Dave was diagnosed, we didn't know that. We got to switch to
Right.
vegetable oil. You got to eat, skim. Never give him, cream. It's like the opposite. So everything you're
Yeah.
told nutritionally as a type 1 diabetic is wrong. It's wrong from the perspective of actual nutrition, but it also happens to be wrong in the physics of how injected insulin works. And that's the next real, when you're going through this as a type 1 diabetic, even if you find a doctor who's, aware of things nutritionally, there are just these technical details about how to use insulin in a low carb context that is not going to be well understood, right? So
Yeah.
that's where Bernstein comes in, and that's why we made those Bernstein videos. Is you're still going to have to learn all these technical details, right?
Yeah.
The good news is there's so many people. Like when I got started with Dave, I met like 2 or 3 people that knew how to do this, and that's it. We all became friends for life. In fact, we started the TypeOneGrit group. But there was nobody out there. Now there's thousands of people out there. You can ask anybody. You can meet, like, you don't want to talk to me because I'm out here in Hawaii, and you feel more comfortable talking to someone in your own state. There's millions, there's not millions, there's thousands of people who are doing this now, right? So you can become friends with any of them. They can coach you through, everyone's doing the same thing. They can coach you through the how to cover meals. Like, how do you cover that steak? You just want to eat a steak. How do you cover it? Do you need any
Yeah.
insulin? You sure do. So, we're
You mentioned,
punching out. We're
yes,
punching
we're
out,
punching out.
Casey, of this standard model.
Yep.
That's the
We're
key.
punching out.
You got to punch out. Yeah.
Yep. And I like what you said, that the idea is getting out there about things like fat. In particular, I think once you start to dance around cholesterol, it gets a little bit more dicey and people are still a little bit confused because the message just keeps giving double down and double down and double down, and they want lower and lower and lower targets for cholesterol. I would just say,
Oh, yeah.
if the people listening to this podcast have probably already punched through that one and understand that the fats are not causing the heart disease, the cholesterol is not
Well,
necessarily the problem, but that must have been scary for you in the beginning, right?
well, yeah, because again, this is the barrier. This cholesterol issue is a big one. And here's the bottom line. Let's avoid, uh, you know, look, the literature is all out there. Let's avoid getting into the deep science. That we can go there, and that's out there. But here's the bottom line. I saw a study. I think girls in the UK who are diagnosed before, age 12 or something like that, young girl, young type 1 diabetes, they're losing almost 15 years of lifespan. And you think, well, okay, so you're going to live to 85 instead of into 70. But the thing is, like I talked to Bernstein about this. He said those people aren't like just losing a few years of life. When they turn about 50, they're living through some significant agony. They're not able to exercise properly. They're not able to digest their food properly. They're in pain. They have claudification of their so there's a whole litany of diabetic complications that you're going to develop. And um, the thing is, you shouldn't be saying to yourself, well, that's the way it is. At least I'm avoiding heart disease by avoiding the eggs. These complications and these early deaths are not being caused by these girls in the UK eating spinach omelets for breakfast. They're caused by high carbohydrate diets, causing roller coaster blood sugars 24/7, 365. The heart disease and type 1 diabetics, the enhanced mortality rates, the early deaths, the complications, they're not caused by eggs. They're caused by high blood sugars, right? And we know the physiology behind how these complications occur. We know what happens when your blood sugar goes high. We know the mechanisms, right? But again, like these are things that you're never going to hear from the diabetes industry. You can go to all these sponsored conferences. You can listen to the same paid diabetes advocates. They don't know anything about how to normalize your blood sugar. They don't know anything. Oh, watch your cholesterol, they'll tell you. As if cholesterol is the reason we're having diabetic complications. Right? So you got to punch your way out. And the industry is designed to make that hill steeper. You're not just punching your way out, but you're inside this bowl and you're going to fall back down. No one's going to help you out and they're going to shove you back down. They're going to scare you. Oh, protein is bad for the kidneys. Fat diets are going to raise cholesterol and cause heart disease. Okay. You know what's bad for the kidneys? You know why the dialysis clinics are popping up all over the place? Not from the spinach omelets. It's because of the high blood sugars in diabetes. The heart disease, the same thing. It's from the pre-diabetics. You can look at the heart disease rate for as a function of A1C. It goes sky high as soon as your blood sugar starts rising from zero. And you mentioned cancer with your mom. My dad died of brain cancer too. The same damn thing. Guess what happens? All cancers rise as blood sugars reach the non-diabetic levels, not the 6.5%, but as soon it's a continuous rise from normal. All cancer rates, right? And they want your kid running 180 and eating the food pyramid diet. When all their patients are at an A1C of 8%, and the majority of their kids are now obese in their practice. But hey,
Bananas.
that's what you're going to get, right? So you got to
Bananas.
punch your way out.
Yep.
Your kid's life is on. You're going to destroy your kid and destroy your family if you follow this advice. Okay, now I'm getting fired up.
Yeah, this is what we're after. I love it. No, in 1961, number one killer of Americans comes out of nowhere is heart disease. Okay, great. So we changed the recommendations. We get to the food pyramid. We get to today. What's the number one killer of Americans? It's heart disease. It's the same thing. And we have all these other epidemics. It's insane. The one reason, the one thing you could say is like, oh, well, hopefully we change the diet and we have less heart disease. We have obesity and diabetes and Alzheimer's and dementia and all these other things. We didn't even fix the original problem, let alone all the other problems that came with it. It's ridiculous. Is now a good time to kind of get into the brass tacks of how we're managing this? Or are there other myths or lies that we want to cover before we get to like, okay, how do we do this? As I'm a parent, you got me on board. I'm fired up. You're fired up. I want to do this the right way. Is there anything we need to discuss before we get to that?
Casey, we have not mentioned the biggie. There is the number one thing that's going to stop you from succeeding at getting out of this mess that you're in. And this was something that Bernstein mentioned to me, but it didn't really set in. And let me put it this way: this conversation that you and I are having, and if you, let's say you knew Dave, if Dave was here, Dave is like he's like the nicest. All these TypeOneGrit kids. It's not just Dave, right? I'll brag on my kid all day, but they're all like spectacular. They're doing spectacularly, right? They understand how to control their condition, right? And that's a huge quality of life thing. By the way, that is like, I met this kid in Washington, D.C. when I was doing stuff with JDRF, and I had lunch with him because we were all in this group, and he was in high school. Dave was a younger kid, and I was talking to him. He wanted to go to a really good college. I can't remember what, but he was taking calculus or whatever, and I'm a physicist, so I was like, did you learn that? Really smart kid. But then what was he eating? He was eating pizza and French fries, which is like an absolute disaster, right? And there was a comment that he was making, like, oh, I guess I'll do 12 units for this, because he knew you could feel the futility. This kid knew that he was at the mercy of his condition. He knew that he was going to eat that food. He was going to take his insulin. He might be 400, he might be 40, right? So the benefit of doing this is that you're in control of your condition. Now, back to my point. If I tell, let's say I take some of my friends, like, I don't know, that came to my wedding, like I went to high school with in college, and I tell them, and they know Dave, tell them what we're doing and stuff. They say, well, of course, right? That only makes sense. And so that's the question, like, well, why, okay, I punched my way out. I understand that, industry doesn't have my best interests. Everyone's suspicious of different facets of society now. So that's not that big a hurdle to cross. And everyone understands, like, that whole egg thing is overblown now. So what's really the thing that's causing people? And the answer is ultra processed food addiction. And that took me by surprise. And what you will see, the pushback that you will see from parents who are listening to conversations like the one we're having right now is, well, can we still have pizza on the weekend? Can we still, what he really likes, French fries. Does that mean I have to not give chips? Or like, what is Dave eating? How could he eat like that? Right. And so when you hear that, I recognize that now as the parents not only realizing that they're going to have to make changes, and changes are painful, but I think they inside they know that they're going to have to change their own diet. And that sounds crazy, that you would not change your diet and send your kid down the tubes and ruin their lives. But if you've ever been on this standard American diet, like it sounds like you were, and I definitely was, because I was a fat beer, pizza, cookie eating slob, 15 years ago. I got pictures to prove it. When you try to stop eating that stuff, man, that freaking devil is in your head. Like I haven't had any addictions to anything else, but I imagine that's what it's like. You have these weird conversations in your head that creep up on you, trying to tell you, like, well, you could eat half the cookie, or you could, I have distinct memories like that. Now, my wife never had that, but people will not give up. They will not. They can't. Like, dude, there's so much obesity in the world right now. Do you think that these people actually want to be obese? It's like, I want to be obese. Like, that's why I'm eating so much. Nobody wants to be, like, okay, somebody wants to, but basically nobody wants to be obese, yet they can't stop. It's obvious that this food is addictive. So now here's the perfect example of, like, the proof. What's the proof? The proof is that no one will quit eating ultra processed foods, even if their kids' health is at stake. So, that is the thing. You have got to get this shit out of your house permanently. And that's the biggest challenge. There's all this other stuff about how to use insulin and with low carb, and how to make low carb cookies and all that stuff. And that's the sad thing, is you really aren't giving up much of anything, because there's a low carb alternative to everything. But people cannot break through. And it's not just like, oh, dumb people. I know, like, in this journey, I started working with incredibly smart engineers, and they're still feeding their kids cereal. And it's like, once I figured it out, it's like, oh, why are you feeding your kids cereal? And I was like, right? Or people get mad at you too. Like, there's been so much vitriol. It's a classic attack the messenger, right? So, there's going to be people that hear this video, and I'm going to get a Christmas card, next year. You saved my kid's life. We've changed everything. But for every one of those, you're going to get 10 haters. Those are the people, those are the crabs in a, look, it's a bowl, right? You heard, that phrase, crabs in a barrel? That's another thing that you got to punch out of. It's everybody who's not succeeding, that's succumbed to this standard method. They don't want you to do better. If you do better, it's proof that they're making a mistake. So they want you and your kid to fail. You have got to find people who are like Dave, and it's not just Dave. You've got to find those. You've got to find a new tribe, right? That's another thing. We're ending up with, it's a nice conversational arc. We're ending up covering all these barriers, and that's certainly one of them, is a social pressure from this type 1 diabetes community. And you are that's like a rule, dude. You'll never find a type 1 diabetic who wants you to have an A1C lower than theirs. If you're running an 8, if you're a parent and your kid's running an 8% A1C, and the neighbor down the street's kid's running a 6%, like, it's not like, oh, good for you. It's like, right? Let alone a 5%. Those are like, that's like incompatible, right?
Yeah, totally.
And they say,
people want you to do well, but not better than them.
Even, dude, that's it. That is it. Yeah, that's it. And the endocrinologists too. Like, there's endocrinologists with type 1 diabetes, and they say stupid things like, oh, only dead people have flat lines. I heard that from a well-known, moron of the diabetes industry, right? And it's like, really? Actually, no. You want to have a normal flat blood sugar all of the time. You don't want to be up and down all the time.
Wow.
So,
wow. Yeah.
The situation stinks from every direction.
Yep. That is such a good quote. And I love that that's been woven through this conversation as well. Yeah, that's such a good point. And people need to be aware of that. That, like, yeah, you're not going to find as much support as you would think from really thriving on this. Okay. So how do we do this? What does a day in the life look like?
Okay.
How are you able to manage this? We got tons of questions about basal insulin versus, fast acting and all the different types, for, again, the parent who's like, okay, you got me convinced. Like, now what do I do? Like, what does that look like?
Okay. The day in the life is a great way to go through it. So, there's a lot to it, but I will give you, a handful of details, which are both important and interesting, because you're not told these things. You're sort of told the opposite. Okay. So, first thing is, Dave started with a basal insulin. A basal insulin is something that you have to take every day, and it stops it's a long-lasting insulin. And what it does is it stops your liver from just collapsing and secreting all its stored glycogen, which is what happens in DKA. Okay, so it's your background insulin, right? And there are many different types of basal insulin. So Bernstein and Dave forever used an insulin called Levemir. And Levemir, you have to inject. Now, this is something you will not be told. You have to inject 2 to 3 times, and in a specific sequence Bernstein recommends to get. But there's a little bit of trial and error to it. Okay, you might be told by your endocrinologist you only have to inject once a day your basal insulin. Most people that are in normalizing their blood sugars inject basal insulin twice a day. So whether they're using Lantus or Levemir, they're injecting multiple times a day, because you can't get this. There's a hump to it, and so you want to smooth. And then there's a valley, and you want to smooth it out by giving 2 shots instead of 1. So Dave's, for example, his Levemir, he would take a dose in the morning, he would take a dose at bedtime. So not a 12-hour split, and not equal amounts. And then I would give him a little extra at 2 in the morning, because there's a little bit more, there's a need for more insulin in the dawn hours. Okay. So that was a demanding scenario. I had to get up every day at 2 in the morning and inject Dave with some insulin, right? As well as check on him. We'll get to that. So this is not an easy method. I mean, diabetes is demanding. This low carb thing isn't like a cure, dude. You got to work. Okay. But I'm not afraid of the work. It was worth it. I was glad to do the work. The depressing thing would be to do the work and be failing, which is what 90% or 99% of most people experience. So that's basal insulin. Now there's a newer basal insulin called Tresiba, and that some people get away with once a day or once and then some small dose before bedtime. So there's some trial and error. Everyone's a little different. And this is where it makes a lot of sense to join a community of low carb people and ask, what's working for you? And people will say, oh, that didn't work for me, and I'll try that. And, you'll get people that are really experienced, right? So anyway, so that's your basal insulin. Now, some people use pumps, and I'll talk about pumps in a second. Okay. We're just going to talk about the Bernstein method right now. Bernstein doesn't like pumps because principally he's scared of pump failures. That's one thing. Another thing that he doesn't like about pumps is that because there's a little needle in your body 24/7, he says that there's some scarring associated with that. And after years of doing that, you're going to have trouble with insulin absorption. Okay. So there are a lot of opinions on that. We'll get to pumps in a second. What about meals? What about low carb meals? Okay. We're getting to the reason why low carb works for type 1 right now. The reason why low carb works for type 1 diabetics is not some nutritional thing. It has nothing to do with nutrition, right? It could have been that junk food is easier to cover with injected insulin than eggs. Then you would have a real problem, because it'd be like, well, there's a healthy way to eat and an unhealthy way to eat, right? But the unhealthy way to eat leads to normal blood sugar. So you'd have a real problem there. But it turns out the healthier way to eat nutritionally is this high protein diet, low processed food diet. And it turns out, thank God, that that's the easiest diet to control with injected insulin. And here's why. Let's take two kids, Dave and someone following the standard model. Now, they're going to eat the same amount of calories for a meal. Dave's going to have a double cheeseburger with lettuce wrap. The other kid's going to have, one less patty, but he'll have bun and some fries. Protein, okay, we're not going to get into the specifics. Protein doesn't turn to glucose if you cover it with insulin. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. But protein has a long, slow requirement for insulin. If Dave eats that hamburger without taking injected insulin, you'll look at his blood sugar. It'll go from 83, and then 4 hours later, it'll be like 250, right? If you don't give the kid who's eating the French fries and the hamburger bun any insulin, his blood sugar will be like 400 in about 20 minutes. So there's a rapid rise from carbohydrates that you don't see with protein foods. That's the trick, because if you've got a slow rise, you can use a slow acting insulin, and Dave will use, and Bernstein recommends using what's called regular insulin. It's an intermediate acting insulin. And your endocrinologist will scream at you that it's an old insulin and you shouldn't use it. This is another thing you have to punch out of to get your right insulin. But it is a slow acting insulin, but that's what you want. You want something where if the injection and the digestion don't quite match up, like let's suppose you inject somewhere in your body and for some reason it's 15 minutes slower than if you would have injected in your arm. And let's suppose you had a few more chews on the hamburger so that hamburger digests a little bit faster. Those little variations, if they're slow over time, won't really amount to much, right? So when Dave eats his meal, he might go from 80 to 110 a couple hours later because he had a little bit of a mismatch. But that's okay, right? That's just life. He's also using less insulin, by the way. Okay, so if he's off by a unit, it won't matter as much. This kid who's eating the French fries, his blood sugar is going to go spiking way high, and he's going to use a fast-acting insulin to try to match it. And if he doesn't get a perfect match, right, his blood sugar is going to go high and then come crashing down, or it's going to go low and then go crashing up. So it's all about matching these rapid rises with the rapid acting insulin versus the slow acting meal and the slow acting insulin, right? It's all about rates of change. And if Dave sees like a couple hours later, I'm still like, now I'm 120 from the hamburger. I didn't take enough insulin. It's like, okay, well, he takes a corrective dose of insulin. That's the next topic, how to correct. So Dave will actually take a unit or a half unit, or maybe a unit and a half, and he'll jam it into his muscle. And now he's using fast acting insulin. And in the muscle, it works twice as fast. And that'll bring that 120 right back down to 80. And if he overshoots to 70 or 60, then he's got to deal with a small low. But what about that kid that's 400? He's going to be at 400 for 6-7 hours before he finally gets his blood sugar back down. And then he might come down too much. He might get frustrated about being so high for so long. And then he's going to be, and this is what you see in the CGMs. You see these people and it never stops, right? I saw a girl today in one of the groups, and she was complaining about this roller coaster. And we asked her, well, what did you eat for breakfast? And she's like, well, I eat bagels for breakfast. It's like, well, you can't,
Oh my goodness.
It doesn't work. You can't cover a bagel with rapid acting insulin. There's too much variability. Sometimes you're going to go high and sometimes you're going to go low. But the variability that's in these slow acting things like an omelet, first of all, the highs and the lows aren't that severe. And second of all, you can detect them and correct them. So like I said, Dave might be coming down to 70 or 60. Oh, but he's got a glucose tab, a few grams of glucose in his pocket. He pops a glucose tab. What about the kid with the French fries? He's coming straight down. It's terrifying, dude, because there's a delay on the CGM. So if you're coming straight down and you're like 110, you're 50 already. So that kid is going to the juice boxes. He's going, there's a panic. You're going to die. This is not the experience of a low carb person. Dave's never used a juice box once in his life. And he's never felt like he's on the precipice of death. You know, he's probably had literally in 10 years, he's had one bad hypoglycemia. And that's because of a miscalculation. And like he used the wrong insulin or something like that. He filled it up with, you know, like there's gradations on the syringe. He might've filled it to 10 instead of 5, you know. So mistakes happen, right? You got to always be on your toes, right? But he doesn't walk around like, I could die any minute. But that's the experience of someone who is eating the French fries and all that stuff. So you have to, so that's the bolus insulin. You have to use an intermediate acting insulin. And then the next thing is, it's a topic that's almost too big to cover, but I'll go over the diet. And the diet is essentially the main component of the diet is protein foods. So every meal leads with protein. So we mentioned omelets, we mentioned hamburgers, we mentioned chicken, we mentioned steaks, right? This is like protein foods. You're going to pound your kid with protein all the time. And the kids might, especially in their athletics, they might be eating 4 or 5 big meals of protein foods. And then Bernstein does allow for some carbohydrates, but it's only in the form of maybe nuts, or he likes fibrous vegetables. He believes that there may be some value in vegetables, right? There's a carnivore movement right now where people think that there's no value in vegetables, and maybe so, but he still allows for, you know, salads, but what he doesn't allow is, like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, no flours, no sugars, no sweet fruits like oranges and bananas. You know, you still have avocados and so on, and no grains. Right. You have to get rid of all that rapid acting stuff. So that's your bolus insulin. That's your basal insulin. We did corrections, you know, like a unit intermuscular. And this is all covered in the book. And then you take some glucose or liquid glucose in a measured dose. There's a chart in the book on how to do that. And then that's your diet. And that's it. That's it. So that's what and essentially it's, and then there's low carb recipes like Bernstein's, in one of his recipe books, there's a recipe for a pumpkin pie with an almond flour crust. And people have, now there's so much stuff out there for low carb recipe. And so we make low carb pizza, we make low carb cookies, we make low carb desserts. And I don't typically eat them because they're very fattening. But if you're an active kid, it's actually great because you need a source of calories, right? So at the end of the day, all you're really doing diet wise is getting rid of the ultra processed foods and then replacing them with protein foods. And then some low carb goodies, that's pretty much like, it's not as dramatic a experience, right? As
It
people
sounds
make it
so
out to
much
be.
more simple. Yeah. And considering that those foods are going to be more satiating. So over time, I'd expect them to take in less and less of the meals, which reduces the times you need to manage that even further. That makes a lot of sense. You mentioned pumps. Is there anything you want to comment about pumps versus directly injected?
Yeah. Yeah. So people do have success. I can't, well, let's just, I'll leave out the details of how to use a pump, but people have success using pumps for sure. And it would be interesting to see, like in the TypeOneGrit group, let's pit the syringe users versus the pump users. I would suspect that there's pretty much, I don't think there's a, I don't see like a big difference in the blood sugars. And now people are using these automated loops. The problem with the commercially available loops is they don't allow you to run normal for obvious reasons. If they allowed you to run normal and you started eating pizza and stuff, you're going to kill yourself. So they have to protect themselves. But what people in TypeOneGrit do is they use these hacked systems. There's something called Loop and I think iApps that people use. And Dave's experimenting with these things too. And his blood sugars are pretty much the same with the Loop. The difference is it helps him at night. He's in college by himself now. So the Loop keeps him flat throughout the night. Before he was on the Loop, I would have to call him in the middle of the night. Dude, your blood sugar is like 140, and he kept a correction needle on his dresser. And or I'd say, dude, you're low. Your blood sugar's 60. And he would drink some glucose, So that got a little bit old for him. He needed to sleep. And so, that helps him. The downside is that it's expensive. He's got to buy these little pumps and change them out every 2 days. And then he's got this thing on him, right? And he's still playing sports and stuff. And it's not ideal. Like he's a young dude. Like you don't want to have this thing on your body, right? So, he's struggling with which system is best for him. That's what I'll say about the pump. Is my opinion, is never get into a camp. Try everything. Don't be like, I use this basal insulin and it's the best, make the other one work, try everything. Because you're going to find subtle differences that might fit your lifestyle a little bit better. Right. Yeah. And we mentioned Dave's away at college now and back to the punching out. I did mention that there's this peer pressure from people that aren't doing well, right? And Dave became kind of a notable figure. And boy, there were parents who couldn't wait for Dave to go to college and fail, right? They have this fantasy that we kept Dave in a cage, and they would propagate these stories on the internet, right? Which is like vastly different from we have a very close family. But that they made it sound like Dave was, abused because we wouldn't even let him have. They said we treated Dave's lows with Brussels sprouts, right? There's some really mentally ill people.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's really. I tell you what, it's really odd, man. I'll tell you one more thing after I tell you this story. And so anyway, the idea would be that Dave was in a cage, and then he went to college, and finally he was free. And then it would be just unrestrained cake and cookies and all that. But what we find in the TypeOneGrit group is that once these kids learn how to keep their blood sugars flat, none of them want to go back to eating junk food. They're not addicted in the first place, so they don't even care for it. And no one wants to be like this all day long. So why,
Yeah.
he's doing spectacularly in college. He knows how to manage his condition. So it's sort of like the fantasy of these parents is sort of the opposite. And then, because we're like public figures for the low carb community, and there are many other people like this, it's interesting to see some of the critics of Dave and how, because there are parents who were high carb parents and their kids grew up. And what I'll say, and these are not just, these are real advocates who run associations and are very vocal and have podcasts and stuff. And it's sad to see what happened to their kids. I have, Dave called me the other day and said, I just, charged, a bunch of money on your Visa card because I'm running the Austin Marathon. I said, do you really want to run a marathon? Because that's kind of catabolic. And we talked about that. He's like, yeah, I'm going to do it, but yeah, I'm going to eat more and I'll be, okay. But some of the kids that are, actually all of the kids who were so vocal at criticizing Dave, the kids are not doing well. They're heavy. And if you're a type 1 diabetic and you're heavy, the inflammation is like double because you literally cannot fatten a kid on this diet. So if you see a kid who's a type 1 diabetic and he's overweight, you know that their blood sugar is also out of control, right? So it's sad what's going on with these kids, but we're trying to get traction into the mainstream, but it's just, again, I can't punch in. You have to meet me halfway. You have to punch out a little bit.
Yeah. One of the questions we got was around how in a world so convoluted with so many different messages, how do we know the people that are telling the truth and the ones we should follow versus the ones that we should probably ignore? And it just seems like, to me, the way I'd answer that is like the people that are figuring this out are also, as always, anywhere in the low carb community, usually the most kind, the most willing to share, the most willing
That's
to
true.
help and set up
Isn't that
calls
funny?
or put out content or do whatever it takes to help anybody who wants it. What would you answer that question with?
I would say that is definitely true, and that's interesting. I would also say that it's interesting, right when Dave was diagnosed and we started doing this, that's when the CGM technology took off and people started posting their graphs. And the Bernstein people were posting these graphs, dude, and they were all like flat, And Dave was like, when he was like 10, he was showing his CGM, right? Dave got a job at advertising for one of the CGM makers, the Biggie, and because he was such a cute kid, he was a quarterback, and he showed his Dexcom, and so he was one of the warriors for their industry, and people ratted him out, and he was dropped because they said, oh, he's under duress. They're whatever fantasy they don't even let him have pancakes or something. Actually, Dave's eating low carb pancakes. So yeah, it is like truly crazy. So I mentioned the CGMs. People started posting the CGMs in their social media groups. Guess what happens if you go to one of these type 1 parent groups and you start posting flat lines and saying, oh, my kid, you'll get thrown out of the group. It's unbelievable. In fact, this podcast, and we're going to leave it on my page. I dare you, if you're in a parent group, leave a link. You'll be thrown out of your parent group. The admins will throw you out because
you should have a parade. You should have a day of the year named after you. You get kicked out.
They will throw you out because they do not want. What was the phrase you mentioned earlier?
People want you to do well, but never better than you.
Never better than you. Yeah. So when you're joining a type 1 parent group, click on the admin and take a look at what kind of shape the admins are in, and you'll get a good feel for how tolerated a healthy lifestyle will be in the group, right? Wow. It's sort of like there's this weird thing. It's sort of like we learned this when we joined one of the charities. It's like a misery pageant. And you have people who will get more attention in their lives from their child's illness than anything else they ever do. And that's not a good dynamic if the attention you're getting is because your child is sick. If your child is thriving, that's good that you're getting attention. Maybe you can spread information about that, right?
Wow.
Like if you're doing poorly and you're getting a lot of attention for how poorly your child's doing, that's a negative incentive and
Wild.
dangerous. And you
Wow.
can see plenty of that, right?
Wow. That's wild.
It's a,
Man, as I'm
it's a
looking
wild,
through this
it's
list,
wild.
yeah, that's crazy. And I understand, again, it's partially human psychology, but still, you would think that people would be a lot more curious about this. As I'm thinking through this and looking through the list of questions that we got, I think we pretty much covered everything. Is there anything else that you want to cover before we kind of put this episode to a close, as far as like a really nice guide for parents with newly diagnosed type 1 diabetics?
Yeah, I think the catch line here is that it's, I say this all the time, and this is a Bernstein. 90% of my wisdom is actually thieved from Bernstein, right? And we didn't talk about him, but there's plenty on him. You can go find it. But the Bernstein line is that it's possible for any person with type 1 diabetes to be as healthy as any of their healthy non-diabetic friends. I mean, that's certainly our experience, right? So when Dave was diagnosed, it was kind of like, take Bernstein's word for it, right? Because he was in his 80s and you know, he had diabetes since he was 12, blah, blah, blah. But now there's many examples of kids that actually are proving that this is true, and yeah, like, and we're still working at it. Dave is, we're still advocating, we're still pushing this because no one else will. Dave is working, he works at Boston Children's Hospital in the summers with Belinda Linares, who's the head author of this pediatrics paper that I mentioned.
Jeez.
And you can find that. And he's doing some research that will hopefully result in a major paper when they finish. So he's doing well, but we're still trying. We're still trying to spread this message. But it is possible. You can you really are, when you're newly diagnosed, you're at a fork in the road, and you can make a choice with the food you eat and how you use insulin to either ruin your family and your child, or make sure that your child is, as I said, as healthy as any of their friends. If you decide that you can do the work, you're gonna have to do the work either way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
If not healthier, I mean, yeah, such a big difference. There was one comment here, one last question. I thought this would be meaningful. We just hosted him, and obviously you know who he is, Andrew Kutnick. Just wanted to know, when you reflect back
legend.
over the last 10 years, what's that?
He's a legend.
Oh, he's a legend. Yeah, he's amazing. Yeah, he's such a stud. When you reflect back over the last 10 plus years navigating type 1 diabetes with your family, what do you think is the biggest lesson you have learned and didn't expect to learn when you reflect back?
So, I mean, a lot of that was covered. I will say this. I suspected, like, this is all that really matters. All those other things are sort of interesting observations, but I suspected, when we were told about how the blood sugar goes up and then comes down and you take insulin to make it go down, I saw that plot and I suspected that there was a way to get that plot to be flat. And we started doing experiments before we discovered Bernstein. And I could not make it work. I could not. We started with cookies, and I started to cut the cookie up and give little bits of insulin. And then we also used measured doses of oatmeal and fat, and I could not get it to work. And I kept getting close. And what I realized was that there was an inherent variability in this insulin carb system that was overwhelming the ability to match. And it wasn't the skill of the person who is doing the carb counting. It was that it was an inherent physical phenomenon, this variability, which was too high. And I happen to do this kind of stuff for a living, right? So I recognized that signal. And about the same damn day that I figured out that that was the variability, the Bernstein book came in the mail. And you could tell, right? Because I opened the book and there it was, like the variability is going to overwhelm the ability. And I realized like there was a way out of this mess. And when I have two distinct memories. One was when Dave's diagnosed, and that creates an emotional trauma. But when we discovered this, when I opened that Bernstein book, I realized that there was a way out of this mess. I realized I was right, that you can keep the blood sugars flat, and that Dave wouldn't have complications and he would lead a normal life. And that's the second moment that is so pivotal. And I urge people to metabolize those ideas and realize that there is a way out of this mess, because that's all that really matters. So that's my answer to Andrew Kotnick, Dr. Kotnick, is that all that really matters is that there's a way out of this mess.
Dude, I think we're going to have a hard time topping that. It was extremely well said, and in hindsight, very interesting that even Dave himself knew that the very first day, basically, like, well, I guess I just won't eat carbohydrates, ended up being true. So it's wonderful, yep. RD. Man, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a really long time. This was an epic marathon. You were willing to go a little bit extra time with us today, and we really are so grateful for you, and wanting to do this has been wonderful. I'm fortunate that I'm not personally touched by type 1 diabetes in my immediate friends and family group, but learning more and more about this and learning about the suffering that you're describing, it's so critical that this message gets out there. So I'm so grateful that not only did you manage the storm of all these people and the backlash and trying to figure this stuff out and punching your way out on your own, but to go out and like have the desire to share it and not shut up about it, I think is absolutely wonderful. So just thank you so very much for all of your work, and thank you for taking time to be on our show today. Where would you like people to go to find you, connect with you and your work, and where should people go if they want to get more information about this and join the TypeOneGrit page?
Yeah, I would say now it's just, thanks for your kind words, by the way. I take it to heart what you're saying. And I think now it's pretty easy to find, go to the TypeOneGrit Facebook page, Diabetes University on YouTube, start Googling low carb type 1 diabetes, and you're going to start seeing all the success stories. Reach out to somebody, reach out to me, or reach out to Bethany McKenzie at Let Me Be 83, join the low carb group on social media. Everything's been put in place for you to have success. There's no shortage of information anymore. You can find everything that you need. Buy Diabetes Solution, the book. It's a little bit impenetrable, but when you go out in the internet and use that book as a guide, it's going to be that much easier. But yeah, we've left a trail of breadcrumbs, me and a bunch of other do-gooders, and it's a vast amount of do-gooders to help other people. So it's not going to be hard to find this information anymore.
It's amazing. Wow. That's amazing. A big part of that is your advocacy and your getting this message out there and creating these groups and being on them every day and helping people endlessly. So again, this was a huge honor and such a pleasure and an amazing conversation. So thank you, RD Dikeman, for everything that you do. And thank you for taking the time to be on our show today. Really appreciate you.
Great job, Casey. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.